So my name is Mike Barsanti. I'm the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. And it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the next in our series of fireside chats. Tonight we have a really wonderful scholar with us. It is Professor Kabria Baumgartner from the University of New Hampshire. I am going to leave it to Deirdre Cooper Owens to give Kabria a full introduction. But for me, I just want to say welcome to another Library Company event and thank you for joining our learning community. I often say the Library Company was a learning community before it was a library, and today you are a part of that tradition and helping us carry on our tradition of talking about important issues in American history and helping to unearth and bring out before the public new ways of seeing our history as Americans. So I'm going to hand it off now to Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens, the director of our program in African American history. Thank you, Deirdre.
Thank you, Mike. And hello to all of you out here. We have a really exciting talk tonight with Dr. Kabria Baumgartner. But first, I want to bring greetings from the program in African American history. It is a real gem in the Library Company of Philadelphia. And it is like Mike Barsanti shared with you, it is a program where we like to think of ourselves as a community of extended learners. And so we are really honored that one of our former fellows, Dr. Baumgartner, will be sharing some work from her award-winning book. I'd also like to thank our IT team and our events manager who helped to put this on, Deja Brock, who is in the background, and also the assistant for the program in African American history, Jasmine Smith, who is also the specialist in our archives in early African American history. So without further ado, I'd like to read the bio of Dr. Baumgartner, but also tell you just a little about her book, In Pursuit of Knowledge. So Dr. Kabria Baumgartner is an associate professor of American Studies in English and a core faculty in the Women's and Gender Studies Department at the University of New Hampshire, where she was named the 2019 Outstanding Assistant Professor, quite an honor. Her research and writing interests focus on African American history, literature, and culture in 19th century New England. She is an author of the award-winning book, In Pursuit of Knowledge, Black Women in Educational Activism in Antebellum America. It was published in 2019 by NYU Press. And it tells the story of African American girls and women who fought to democratize public and private schools in the 19th century Northeast. She has also published numerous scholarly articles and book chapters, and her op-eds and other popular writings have been featured in the Washington Post, WBUR's blog, Cognoscenti, and Historic New England magazine. Dr. Baumgartner is writing a biography of the African-American lawyer, Robert Morris. I cannot wait until that book comes out. If you'd like to learn more, we'll have her website in the chat, but you can go to www.kabriabaumgartner.com. Also, you can purchase her book, In Pursuit of Knowledge. We will have that link in the chat for you. And I'd also like to share with you, before we hear from Dr. Baumgartner, a link, because we are extending Black History Month in the program of African American history, and also listing a number of Black-owned bookstores where you can also purchase In Pursuit of Knowledge. So without further ado, the next voice you'll hear will be Dr. Baumgartner. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, and before you begin, we will have a Q&A function. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I will moderate the question and answer after Dr. Baumgartner's talk. So please put your questions in the Q&A. All right, thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to join you virtually. Thank you to Dr. Cooper Owens for that gracious introduction, and to Jasmine Smith and Deja Brock and the LCP team for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you to all of you for spending some time with me this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So it's great to give this talk too, in part because I have really fond memories of being in residence at the Library Company of Philadelphia. I guess this was back in 2013, 2014. And I remember working alongside librarians and archivists and fellow researchers there. I was fortunate to have received one of the first postdoctoral fellowships in the program in African American history. And for me, it really came at the right time. It was invigorating. There were other researchers there exploring women's education and early Black history. There were colloquia and informal chats. I remember conversations that I had with Crystal Appia, Jim Green, and others. So it's just a really rich intellectual environment. And actually, I remember the quietness and stillness of the reading room, which really energized me. And who could forget the huge card catalog cabinet in the reading room? I also want to thank Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. She was the inaugural director of the program in African American history. And she really encouraged me during the research phase of this project when I was feeling a bit downcast. I was asking myself, was this project viable as a book? Would any press want to publish it? And more importantly, how could I make readers see the significance of Black women's early educational activism? And Dr. Dunbar sat me down and reminded me that there were so few scholars studying early Black women's history and that my insights were needed. So I kept working on a project, which would eventually become this book. And I would say that it's an award-winning book, it is, but I say that not to brag as much to encourage other scholars, especially early career scholars, to keep going and to not give way to some of those doubts that might creep in. So I didn't expect that I would write a book about education, but studying the educational movements of the early 19th century United States really piqued my interest. And so there were at least three educational movements that are often discussed in the scholarship. The first is the common school movement, which saw the expansion of public schools. Our modern day public school system dates back to this common school movement. There was the female seminary movement, which was fairly significant in women's higher education. It saw over 300 institutions established in the pre-Civil War era. And then you have the rise of colleges and universities, particularly in New England, with institutions like Amherst College and Williams College. So we're thinking about these educational movements and we're thinking about the African-American experience, right? I'm thinking, well, how did African-Americans engage with these movements? African-Americans were segregated or altogether excluded from common schools. They were barred from most female seminaries, and they were often tokenized at most colleges and universities. So I then started to consider the intersection of race and gender in this educational landscape, focusing particularly on the experience of young Black women. And I figured that there was a deeper, compelling story to be told about the educational activism of young Black women who faced numerous obstacles. But those obstacles did not result in their virtual absence in education. On the contrary, they fought even harder. And I, as a historian, just had to locate the sources to make this argument. And so this book is my 10-year labor of love, of evidence and sources and interpretations, insights, and stories that prove that African-American girls and women were educational reformers, fighting for their educational rights in the 19th century Northeast. And one of the key points of the book is that Black women's pursuit of knowledge was not espoused by one particular charismatic leader or confined to one singular endeavor, but rather it was collective, it was dynamic, and it was part of an emerging network. And so my book maps this network of young Black women who had clear and robust plans for reforming education. And they sought specifically to reverse policies of racial exclusion at public schools, at private female seminaries, and also in the teaching profession. And so in tracing this network, the book shows that Black women actually modeled this concept, or this kind of purposeful womanhood is how I call it. And it's really defined by being resilient and being resourceful and being forward-thinking as they sought to live their purpose, especially amid the severe forms of oppression that existed in the early 19th century Northeast. So the first 4 chapters of my book trace the continuous activism of young Black women in this network, writing essays on against racism. They were organizing, they were establishing schools. And so what I want to share with you this evening is the 5th part of my book, the 5th chapter, which examines the first known case, legal case in the nation to challenge racial exclusion in public schools. And that was the Roberts versus the City of Boston case. So the decision to pursue legal action to democratize public schools was one of many strategies that African Americans used to confront and resist racial exclusion in public education. And Boston was a particularly fitting site for this. In 1820, Boston counted around a little over 1,700 Black residents, making it one of the larger free Black communities in the North, but it was not the largest. And Black residents in Boston were kind of crowded into the North End area of the city before eventually migrating to the Beacon Hill area. They built their own religious, social, and political institutions, but also keep in mind that they were being subjected to racial discrimination in employment, in education, and other areas. So inequality and racial segregation were built into the Boston public school system, right, from the very beginning. So Boston public schools officially opened in the 1780s, and from there expanded to include not just primary schools, but grammar schools, and much later high schools. And African-American children were, for the most part, shoved into one school building, right? The Smith School building, which is pictured here. And the Smith School was named after Abiel Smith, who was a white benefactor, and bequeathed some funds to the school to keep it functioning, to keep it in operation. The building housed 2 primary schools and 1 grammar school. So quite literally, it housed all of African-American public education in the city. So imagine this building with 260 children, all different ages, all different abilities, with maybe 4 to 6 teachers and assistant teachers in that building, right? It's very, very crowded, to say the least. So African-American activists complained. They complained that the Smith School was deficient because it was overcrowded, because it lacked a yard and green space, because it did not receive the same resources as white schools in the city. In August of 1838, Primus Hall, and 30 African-American activists. In this petition, they're all male activists. They petitioned the Boston School Committee requesting the expansion of the Smith School building. And what the Boston School Committee and the City Council decided is not really clear, but we do know that the Smith School building was not expanded. But what did expand was the equal school rights movement. And this is kind of a forgotten or lost history when we think about New England's history. Equal school rights movement was a regional effort to dismantle racial exclusion in public education in 19th century New England. States like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, right? There were equal school rights supporters in those states pushing for equality education for all children, right? On an equal basis, regardless of race. So that was one of the major tenets of the movement. And the other was to democratize public schools, right? That there would be something transformative and inclusive in the way that knowledge would be disseminated. So activists pursued a range of strategies and tactics, from writing editorials and petitioning local school committees to boycotting schools, which we see in the Boston case, and also filing lawsuits. And that's what we see in the case of Roberts versus the city of Boston. So I'm just going to summarize the case in a nutshell, and then I'll talk about sort of my analysis of the case. So it goes something like this. Benjamin and Adeline Roberts, a free Black couple, and also they come from Boston activists, and so that part is important. They come from activist families on both sides. They were the parents of Sarah Roberts, and they sought to challenge racially exclusive practices in Boston public schools. And since the Roberts family lived closer to the all-white co-ed Otis school, Benjamin decided to enroll his 5-year-old daughter, Sarah, at that school in 1847. And she was admitted, so she was able to go to that school. But a few weeks later, she was expelled, and a police officer actually escorted her off of school property. In March of 1848, Benjamin Roberts hired Robert Morris, one of the first African-American lawyers in the United States and the subject of my next book. He represented Sarah in the lawsuit against the city of Boston. And the Suffolk County Court of Common Pleas ruled in favor of the city of Boston, right? The Boston School Committee. And then Morris filed an appeal to be heard at the Massachusetts Judicial Supreme Court in October of 1848. And that's when Charles Sumner joined the Roberts legal team. In 1849, the court ruled in favor of the Boston School Committee. They argued that basically the school committee had a right to regulate the system of distribution and classification of children in public schools. If that meant race, if that meant religion, that was fine. So this first case, it's the first known case, legal challenge, right? What we might call a racial school segregation case today. That case had failed, right? And it failed in 1849. So there's lots of great scholarship focusing on the legal aspects of the case. But I had some different questions about Sarah Roberts. Most scholars hadn't really focused on Sarah Roberts. It's often only in juvenile literature that she's prominently featured. As you can see here on the cover of this book, this is obviously not her. We actually don't have any photographs or images of Sarah Roberts, but you can see here in Susan Goodman's book that she's at the center, right? The First Step, How One Girl Put Segregation on Trial, came out in 2016. So I had other questions about Sarah. How did she feel being able to attend the Otis School for a short period of time? And actually, why was she expelled after 2 weeks or 3 weeks? What did she think about the lawsuit that her parents had initiated on her behalf? She's 5 years old, right? But even as the case was playing out when she was 6 and 7, what were her impressions? What did she think sitting in that courtroom? Because according to the court transcript, she was there. So what did she think listening to these arguments about the wrongs of racial exclusion and the necessity of equality before the law? So anyone who studies marginalized people of the past knows what a challenge it is to get answers to these kinds of questions. And especially for those who study childhood, it's really difficult to get answers to these kinds of questions given the lack of surviving documents. So I decided to read the evidence that I had a little bit differently, but I was going to center Sarah Roberts in the documents and the material that I had. And I wanted to start with a question that I should probably be able to answer, I thought at the time, which was, why was Sarah expelled after a short period of time? And some sources say it was a few weeks. It could have been even as long as a month. But the question is, what happened in that time, right? What changed? Well, Sarah's father actually reported that Sarah enjoyed equal treatment and courtesy, those are his words, at the Otis school. And this is an interesting point because sometimes in the, let's say, 1840s, 1850s, those who were against racial school integration argued that there was an inherent racial animus between African Americans and whites, and so they had to be separated. So for Sarah's father to report that actually Sarah got along well with her classmates was, pretty important. And in fact, they thought that she was doing so well there and that she was being treated equally, that they applied to enroll their 9-year-old son, Benjamin Jr., in a higher department at the Otis school. And they notified the powers that be, and the powers that be balked at the idea. They said, no, we are not going to have Benjamin Jr. at this school. So it seems like the prospect of yet another African-American student at this school was so unpalatable that the Boston School Committee refused to admit Benjamin Jr. and actually expelled Sarah. So this part of the story, to me, was really crucial, and I hadn't really seen any other scholars kind of taking it up. Benjamin Sr.'s decision to sue on Sarah's behalf and not on his son's behalf was strategic. Benjamin Jr. had been denied outright an entry to the Otis school and could have easily sued the city of Boston under this 1845 Massachusetts law that granted legal protection to a child who had been excluded from a public school. But Benjamin Sr. apparently declined to do that. Instead, it seems that he was thinking about and possibly relying on cultural attitudes at the time that made his daughter a more sympathetic plaintiff. In fact, Sarah's age and gender enabled equal school rights supporters to argue that it was not only wasteful and tiring and inconvenient, those were their words, for African-American children to travel great distances from their home to reach the Smith School, but it actually exposed the health of African-American females, right? That's a direct quote. It exposed the health of African-American females. So they could now start to make gendered arguments about equal school rights. And later on, Benjamin Sr., and this is maybe 20 years later in an interview, he admitted that he had planned to act on this issue of equal school rights. He said when he was in a more fitting position to embark upon a practical experiment. And an experiment, that's what he called it, which I think is a loaded term, right? Because it's signifying hypothesizing and planning and testing. And that experiment was to enroll Sarah at an all-white public school closest to their family home. And so in some ways, the Otis School was like Benjamin's lab. And he pushed Sarah forward then as the icon around which Black educational justice should be realized. If we examine Charles Sumner's argument in this judicial state Supreme Court case, he never once called Sarah by her name. So Sarah Roberts is it's the case, right? But he doesn't use her name in his argument. And instead, he refers to her as a little child. He refers to her as that about 3 times. And I think that was meant to heighten the need for the court to protect Black children's opportunity for schooling. He also tried to capture Sarah's voice, a pleading voice, when he said, "She calls upon you to defend her personal rights." And I think there's this idea that perhaps the vulnerability of an African-American girl would sway the judge and affirm the rights of Black children to an equal education. But we know the court did not affirm that. The court rejected it. Even the possibility was there, but the court still rejected it. And I think that part of Benjamin Sr.'s experiment failed, right? And the case actually set a precedent for the separate but equal doctrine. So that doctrine is, of course, cited in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson. But it's important that we realize that the separate but equal doctrine is actually born in Boston. So it's not Southern, but it's actually Northern, and it comes from this judicial Supreme Court case. Benjamin Sr., right after the loss of the Roberts case, then mounted a petition campaign to the Massachusetts state legislature. He gathered nearly 500 signatures by 1851. And the petition, which was written and signed by African-American activists, stated their grievances, right? The petition asserted their rights as, quote, natives of the state. And I do think that language is a veiled reference to the increase in Irish immigration at this point in Boston. And the petition also explained African-Americans' opposition to the Smith School. And here I'll just say, of course, not all African-Americans were against the Smith School, but many were trying to pursue equal school rights. And so the Smith School wasn't conducive to that. So Roberts' petition actually received some support in the Massachusetts legislature, but ultimately it didn't result in the passage of equal school rights legislation at that point, 1851, 1852. It would actually be a couple of years later, and there would be another petition campaign. And that one was led by William Cooper Nell. He was a Black activist from Boston, and he also helped to gather signatures. And he presented those signatures to Charles Slack, who was a Massachusetts legislator, and it wound its way and it was signed by the governor. So in 1855, there was an equal school rights bill that forbade school committees from using race to assign students to public schools, right? So now the school committees could no longer use race to organize children. So many Black Bostonians celebrated the civil rights milestone. Charlotte Fortin played a key role in gathering signatures for the petitions and raising funds. It was very much a community effort. And you'll see William Cooper Nell's signature here on the Boston petition. And Benjamin Sr. also reflected on this historic victory some years later. He said, "The doors were thrown wide open, and it was to us the greatest boon ever bestowed upon our people. Our children do not feel now as their predecessors felt 1,000 times while passing a schoolhouse, as inferiors and outcasts. To them, new ideas are opened, and it will not be many years before the results of this glorious change will find many of our successors in the full enjoyment of positions of honor." So for Benjamin, whole new vistas of possibility had opened, right, with the passage of this equal school rights legislation. And given his hopeful remarks here, I too wondered whether Sarah had carried on the mantle of Black education. I thought perhaps, as a lot of middle-class Black women pursued, maybe she became a teacher. But I soon learned that she did not. In the 1870s and 1880s, the Roberts case lived on in public memory, even though the details of the battle probably faded from people's minds. There was a newspaper, the Christian Era, that published a 20th anniversary retrospective in 1869, talking about the case, noting that Sarah was but a little colored girl in 1849. But Sarah, the little colored girl, had matured into a woman in her mid-20s. And in my exploration or examination of her life and biographical details, I have found no records of her ever talking about the case. So it seems to me that while the Equal School Rights campaign had dominated her childhood, I get the sense that she purposefully decided that this history, as important as it was, would not define her adulthood. So as a woman, she made New Haven County her home, navigating life's many challenges, personal, social, and legal. She was arrested a couple of times. She labored as a washerwoman in New Haven, like many Black women, educated or not. And if not washerwomen, then some Black women worked as domestic servants. As the scholar Nazera Wright argues, African-American leaders knew that no matter how educated a Black girl might become, she would face nearly insurmountable obstacles when she left her family home to make her way in the world. So one of the important points that I make in the book is that as much as I want to tell a triumphant story about educational access and opportunity, we also have to realize that education was not a panacea for African Americans. It didn't suddenly broaden their occupational opportunities, nor did it completely protect them from poverty. And as I discuss in the book, it was really Black girls who catalyzed these equal school rights campaigns in the Northeast. They helped to build a network that enabled petitions to be circulated, boycotts to be formed, and legal cases to be mounted. And their activism took many different forms, from writing and petitioning to organizing. Yet no matter the form of activism, there were two principles that really drove them. The first is that they refused to accept the idea that the existing system of schooling was the best possible. For them, the fight for equal school rights was a matter of freedom and justice. And second, they were inspired to pursue knowledge and to reform American schooling and teaching in ways that were inclusive and transformative. But all of this really came at a cost, especially for someone like Sarah Roberts. And the historical record doesn't even allow me to fully calculate those costs. So for me, when I'm thinking about a story like Sarah and the fight for equal school rights, it really compels us to first wrestle with the importance of schooling as well as its limits, right? Especially for marginalized people. Second, it compels us to consider the consequences of placing vulnerable children at the center of causes that shouldn't require their presence in the first place. And third, it compels us to understand what it really means, right, for the African-American girl to be an icon for educational justice, because we see it in the 19th century with Sarah Roberts, and there are other African-American girls I talk about in the book, but also in the 20th century, right, with Linda Brown, and as the lead plaintiff in Brown v. Board, Ruby Bridges in New Orleans, and Melba Patillo Beals as part of Little Rock Nine, right? There's this legacy and this tradition, but it's a heavy legacy, and it comes at great cost to these childhood, a great cost to childhood and girlhood. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baumgartner, for a wonderful talk. I am going to now ask our attendees, please place your questions in the Q&A, right? And as you're as you're doing that, if you're unfamiliar with the Q&A, you can put it in chat because I'll be monitoring both. But as you were talking about this story of educational activism, right? That Black families and Black women are really wielding, it made me think about someone whose name has in some ways been lost to the historical record as well. I got my master's degree in African American Studies from Clark Atlanta University, and one of my professors was Josephine Bradley. And she wrote about in her dissertation a lot of the emotional trauma she felt, much like Sarah Roberts, because she integrated high school in Greensboro, North Carolina in the 1950s. And the NAACP was doing these test cases, as you know, with the Little Rock Nine. And then she kind of felt like the Little Rock Nine case and Daisy Bates kind of cannibalized her. And she was really resentful, right? And here she was, this lone girl, very petite woman facing this angry mob and having to carry the mantle of the race on her back. And at the end of it, no one really knew who she was or remembered her sacrifice. And it made me think about the kind of emotional cost that you did hint at a bit towards the end of the talk, but did you want to expand on that more? Were you thinking about how to really integrate the impact of children having to be the symbols for such an awesome burden?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. When I was thinking about someone like Sarah Roberts, I was thinking about that emotional trauma. And it's one of those things as a historian, I want to say more, but I don't have enough evidence to support some of the conclusions. So I can't say for sure that how traumatized she was by this case. But given the fact that there are probably no records of her talking about it, I've looked everywhere. And I should say there's parts of Sarah's story that I talk more about in the book and then in a subsequent article where she ended up changing her birth year. So that means that she would actually have been born after the case. So that means that she really ran away from it. She wasn't going to talk about it. There wasn't really anything she could put her name on, maybe anonymously, but she wasn't going to address it. And that to me suggests the kind of trauma. But I couldn't really make that point. But the 20th century cases talk about it. And that's what's really interesting about this icon. The Black girl is an icon for educational justice. Because in Warriors Don't Cry, Melba Pattillo Beals talks about the violence she experienced. It was just crushing to her. She talks about the emotional trauma of segregation, but then of being one of the Little Rock Nine. And so that is there. And I think for me, that was sort of the end of the book too. And I was thinking, is there a way to pick this up and to think about it? I do know of another historian, Francoise Hamlin, who's doing some research on, I think her book is about the costs of to Black children having to be the face of these movements. But it's something to think about. There's one part of me that wanted to celebrate Black women's activism and Black children's activism, and that's there too. But then there's this other side where it really comes at a cost.
Yeah, thank you. We do have a question from one of the attendees. Adam McNeil says, amazing discussion, Professor. I am so happy to have your work in the world. I used to work at Boston African American National Historic Site and spoke at length about Sarah Roberts's case. Can you discuss the contemporary legacy of the case and how, as an educator in New England, the case is currently taught in the region?
Great question, thank you. So I actually find that the case is not often taught, and I sort of base this on, just kind of what I read, having children who, go to school in the area. It's not a case that's often taught, and what's not taught is the fact that separate but equal is connected to that case. So most people think about Plessy v. Ferguson, this is the South, and that somehow fits the narrative, but they don't realize that separate but equal is actually part of Massachusetts legal history, and it comes about through this school integration case. So I do think that we should be teaching it more. For my own kids who I wanted to try to explain what I was doing, I bought them, Sarah, I don't know if you guys can see it because I got the background on, but I bought them The First Step because I wanted them to understand the experiences of Black girls, right, as they're trying to pursue knowledge and the kinds of obstacles that they faced as they were trying to do that. So no, there isn't much to me of a discussion of the case in public schools. I think there could be more. I think also there was really this sense that Sarah, there wasn't much about her after 1870. Mm-hmm. And so I probably spent maybe upwards of 9 months trying to find what happened to her. And finally I did. And part of the reason why so many people couldn't find out is because she changed her birth year. So when you're going through the census records and you're trying to figure out these years, it's not there. So at least now I have her later life, which I think tells us a little bit about how this impacted her.
Yeah, there's so much about what you spoke about. I was really caught with this story, like you said, of separate and equal, not even being a story about adults, right, but a story about girls, Black girls in particular, and what it does to kind of pivot a conversation around civil rights.
Right.
When we think about the role of children, I think that was something that's really important, and to also think about this as an American story, because you see this kind of racial apartheid is happening in every region. So I just thought that was something that was really important to kind of bring up as well. And also, I want to get back to this, even though we have another question. Talk about how education is not the panacea to use words. These folk are still out here washing clothes.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't protect them at all in the ways that we wanted it, we as a contemporary society wanted to, and then also their parents, their family,
that's right,
their community.
That's right. That's a great point. I mean, I so wanted Sarah to be a teacher. Like that to me was going to fit this narrative, this long struggle for equal school rights. And we do have other examples of African-American women becoming teachers. So I thought that she would fit into that. And especially because she comes from this activist family. And it was actually really quite sobering, and it put a lot into perspective for me to realize that was not the path for her. And it made me think, and I also talk about another African-American girl named Rosetta Morse, and she goes to a female seminary, she gets this prestigious education, and she ends up marrying a self-emancipated slave. And after the fugitive slave law, they're running away and they're fleeing because they're so scared and preoccupied that he's going to be caught and rendered back to slavery. And so she also ends up as a washerwoman, but she has this super prestigious education. She studied botany, she studied French. And it made me realize that as much as I want to tell these triumphant stories of education, that those are not always the stories to tell, right? And that education doesn't exist in a vacuum. We have to be thinking about what I like to call, or what's often referred to as other parts of the system. Mm-hmm. So in the case of Rosetta Morrison, slavery was the problem, right? And that really impeded what she could make, what her family could be and what she could do, right? And you see that too with Sarah Roberts. She's divorced a couple of times, just a very rocky moments in her life. And that's also part of the struggle, right? They're pushing for this education, and those are the costs that they have to kind of bear, even if they have supportive families, even if, it's just not, as you said, it's not going to protect them from economic precarity.
Yeah. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions. This is from Kamika Williams-Witherspoon, who thanks you for your presentation. And she wants to know, do we know about the physicality of Mr. and Mrs. Roberts? She asks because she wonders whether Sarah Roberts' physicality made her more palatable to her classmates and teachers at the Otis School. Were the drawings of the plaintiffs in the legal records, or were there drawings, excuse me,
drawings, yeah.
legal records? And she's also wondering whether she passed for those first few weeks until her brother Benjamin's case made her more visible.
Those are great questions. You know, I can't really get a sense of Sarah's physicality. Aside from the descriptions of Charles Sumner, who keeps calling her a little child. So I don't have a sense of that. What I do have, interestingly, is a photograph of her brother. And I don't think neither her brother nor anyone in the Roberts family, I don't think they identified, I don't think they could pass, and I don't think they wanted to pass. It was, I think, pretty fairly clear that Sarah Roberts was a Black girl and that she was sitting in that classroom at the Otis School, and she was treated fairly and equally. I don't think that's really in doubt. In terms of her physicality, though, no, I don't know what that is. And I've searched everywhere trying to find a picture of her, and there isn't. But yes, there is one of her brother. And the Roberts family is huge. There are lots of parts of that family tree. But I don't have any sense that she passed or that anyone in that family, in the immediate family, passed as white.
Thank you. This question is from Claudia Becker. Can you comment on the fact that during this time, the late 1840s, 1850s, in some states, it was illegal to educate Black persons, how that influenced the separate but equal approach, or how did that influence the separate but equal approach in Massachusetts? Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So in the South, in the early 19th century, anti-literacy laws were passed. And not just they not only applied to enslaved African Americans, but also to free Blacks in some of those laws. It's my understanding that in New England, African American children could get a common school education, but it was segregated. So you had African schools. On one of the slides, I talked about the educational movements of the day, and I have the three, and I want to add a fourth as another project. I want to talk about the African school movement, because I do think that was important. And you had African American leaders and communities who would open schools to support the children, and sometimes public funds would be used for that. So African Americans, at least in New England, weren't entirely barred from literacy. But there was sometimes violence when they tried to go beyond what we call a primary school education. And so we have examples in Connecticut. Connecticut passed something called the Black Law, which forbade African Americans from out of state to come to the state to learn. So, and there's a eerie resemblance between that law and the anti-literacy laws. So we do have examples of that, but for the most part, a common school education, African Americans could get one if community members set up an African school.
Well, I'm going to ask you to leave us with a takeaway. If there's anything that we are going to leave here needing to know about this story, about this portion of American history, what is it? So that we can educate others.
Yes, maybe two things. Okay. So that separate but equal is not just Southern, it's not just Northern, but as I think you said it too, it's an American story. And it absolutely, the origins of it are in Massachusetts, surrounding this case for school integration with a Black girl at the center. That's the first one. And then the second one is that this fight for education, while there are these obstacles that African American girls and women overcome, and that there are these victories, if you will, those victories come at great cost. And so we're still to this day fighting for equal school rights. So in some ways, if we want to preserve Black childhood, we'll actually solve this issue for our children now, so they don't have to be at the center and at the front of this fight.
Thank you so, so much for sharing your work with us. I hope that you will join us again when the newest book on Robert Morris is published.
Absolutely.
Also, yes, I thank our attendees, our guests, for joining us. As always, you know, without your support, we wouldn't be able to do this, to be able to bring such brilliant, award-winning scholars. And we have to brag because they're also former fellows of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia. So it makes us feel good that these records that are available to the public are being used in such important and critical ways. So thank you all. I hope you have a good evening. Thank you, Dr. Baumgartner, and also Dr. Bersanti. Thank you for providing opening greetings for us today. I hope you all have a good evening. Bye-bye.